So this video is going to pick up where we left off on section 4.1, and we're going to finish 4.1. Now, last time we talked about how when you're factoring, you should always try common factor first. We talked about difference of squares if you have two terms. We talked about trial and error if you have three terms. And we're going to kind of take a step back before we get started. I only showed you one option for two terms, but there's actually another option. The most common is what we did, difference of squares. But probably the less common is you might have what we'll call a cube plus or minus a cube. Okay, so if we go down to, we did 2a, which was the difference of squares. Now we're going to go down to 2b, okay, and we're going to talk about cube plus or minus a cube. And the thing about this is where squares were numbers like 4, 9, 25, 36, 49, right? 64, 81, 100. Cubes would be numbers, let's think about this. So 1 cubed is still 1, but 2 cubed is 8, 3 cubed is 27, 4 cubed is 64, 5 cubed is 125. And actually, yeah, I will expect you to know those cubes without a calculator. So that's something you might want to write down. And the good thing about cubes, yeah, it's ugly, it seems hard, it looks way intimidating, but it's just a formula. So in order to factor using cubes, what we say is you factor it into two parentheses. One of the parentheses is going to have just two terms in it, and one of the parentheses is going to have three terms. So I'll give that one a little bit more space. And so here's the idea. Maybe instead of using the phrase cube plus or minus of cube, I'm going to give that a more generic name. I'll say a cubed plus or minus b cubed. So a cubed plus or minus b cubed. In fact, why don't we start with the plus version? Okay, so whatever's being cubed is what goes into the first parenthesis. So a plus b. So for example, on letter A, what's being cubed here is x, and what's being cubed here is 3. So if I set up my two parentheses, I'm going to have an x and a 3. Now, since that's a plus, that means this is a plus. And then the second parenthesis is going to be a squared, and then whatever the opposite sign is. So since that's a plus, this would be a minus. And the middle term is whatever a times b is. This one is always a plus, and then b squared. So in this case, my a was the x and my b was the 3. So for this parenthesis, a squared would be x squared. So since that's a plus, that means this is a minus. The middle term is a times b, so x times 3 is 3x. The next one is always a plus, and then I need the b squared, so 3 squared is 9. And I don't have to check anything, I just have to fill into my formula. Okay, so you should be asking, well, how is that different if it's a minus? Well, I'm glad you asked. If it's a minus, again, the first parenthesis is whatever you start with. So if it's a minus over here, then it's a minus in the first parenthesis. And since this one is always the opposite, this would be a plus. And since this one is always plus, it would stay a plus. So if I look at letter B, I know it's a cube because 64 is 4 cubed and 125 is 5 cubed. So a smaller parenthesis and then a bigger parenthesis. What's being cubed to get 64? Well, that's 4. And what's being cubed to get a cubed? That's a. Since this is a minus, that means I start with a minus. What's being cubed to get 125? Well, that's a 5. Okay, and so now over here, I need the first one squared. So 4a squared would be 16a squared. Since this is a minus, I want the opposite, so plus. The middle term is a times b, so 4a times 5 would be 20a. And then the last one is always a plus, and 5 squared is 25. Again, I know it's ugly, but I don't have to check anything. I just fill into the formula. Okay, so that's cubes. And then back up to the top, the last kind of factoring is if you have 4 terms, and that one is called grouping. Okay, grouping. So we're going to go down to the bottom of page 107 where it says 4 terms. Okay, so this is where we do grouping. And the thing about grouping is it's really doing common factor 3 times. Okay, I'll show you what I mean by that. So if you look at letter A, I've got 4 terms. So I'm going to group the first 2 together and the second 2 together. So from the first 2, is there a common factor? Well, sure, I can take out an x squared. So if I take an x squared out of just the first 2, I'm going to have x plus 3. Okay, bring that sign down, so plus. So I just did common factor 1 time. And so now I'm going to look at the last 2. And I'm going to do common factor on the last 2, 5x plus 15. Well, my common factor is 5. And then in the parenthesis, I'm going to have x plus 5 times what is 15? 3. Okay, so I've done common factor twice. And now if you look at this, there are 2 big ugly terms. This is all one term, and this is all one term. Well, don't both of those have the same parenthesis, x plus 3? So I'm going to take out the x plus 3 as my common factor. Okay, and so if I take the x plus 3 out of this first one, all I have left is x squared. Bring down the plus sign. If I take the x plus 3 out of that second term, what I have left is 5. So that, whoops, almost crossed it out. That is what I get when I do grouping. Okay, so what I actually did was common factor 3 times. All right, look at letter B. I'm going to group it. I see 4 terms, so I'm going to group the first 2 and the last 2. So my common factor for the first 2 is, let's see, 2a. Okay, if I take out a 2a, I'm going to have 3x minus 2a out of the 10a would be 5. Okay, that's from the first 2. Bring down that minus sign. And so now my only common factor is b, but I need to be careful because of that minus sign, I'm really taking out a negative b. So when I take negative b out of the 3bx, all I have is positive 3x. But if I take a minus out of the plus, that's going to make it be a minus. Think about it. If you distribute negative b times the minus, it would become a plus. And then what am I going to have left is the 5. Okay, so I did common factor for the first 2, common factor for the second 2. And so do you notice this is all one term, this is all one term. And hopefully what you're noticing is those parentheses are always going to be the same, right? This parenthesis is the same as this one. If they're not, then you're doing something wrong. Okay, and so now, do you see that both of those have the parenthesis 3x minus 5? So I put the 3x minus 5 out in front. And then what do I have left in this one? Just 2a. What do I have left in this one? Just the minus b. So there is my factor by grouping. Okay, so now we've talked about all 4 kinds of factoring. So this is really kind of my go-to. How do I know what kind of factoring to use? It's all based on how many terms there are, right? Common factor is the only one that can be used on any number of terms. Otherwise, it's all about how many terms there are. Okay, so look at this last section. Notice the directions say factor completely. That means they're not telling me what kind of factoring to use. Okay, so here's my approach. As soon as I look at it, no matter how many terms, look for common factor. So when I look at letter A, yes, I see 2 terms, but the first thing, is there a common factor? Well, I think so. Doesn't 8 go into both of those? So if I factor out an 8, I'm going to have x squared minus 4. So I just did common factor, but that doesn't mean I'm done. Look inside the parenthesis. I have 2 terms, and isn't that a difference of squares? So I can leave the 8 alone, but that x squared minus 4 is going to turn into 2 parentheses, x plus 2, x minus 2. So not only did I do common factor, but I also did difference of squares. So that's why it says factor completely. You might be able to factor it one time, but then you look and see if you can factor it again. Okay, so on letter B, I see 3 terms, but I don't automatically jump to trial and error. First, I look for a common factor. So let's see. I definitely can take out an x. What about the numbers? I can't take a 6 out of 50, but I could take a 2 out of all of them, right? Why don't I try that? If I take out a 2 and an x, that's going to leave me with 3x squared minus 25x minus 18. Okay, so I just did common factor. But before I say I'm done, look inside the parenthesis. I see 3 terms. I wonder if I could do trial and error. So here's what I'm going to think about. I'm talking about just for this part. I wonder if I could try to turn that into 2 parentheses. So remember trial and error, that means different signs. So a plus and a minus. The only way to get 3x squared is 3x times x. Okay, now to get 18, well, let's see. I would start with 6 and 3, but I can't put either a 6 or a 3 here, right? So why don't we switch to 9 and 2? If I go 9 and 2, I can't put the 9 over here with the 3, but I could put the 2 and then the 9. So let's check. The outer would be negative 27x. The inner would be positive 2x. That works. That does give me that minus 25, right? So now don't forget, I had that 2x out in front. I didn't do anything to that. I just left it there. So this is what I get if I factor completely. So first I did common factor, and then I did trial and error. Okay, so look at letter C. I see 3 terms. Is there a common factor? No, there's not. There's no common factor. Okay, so if there's no common factor and there's 3 terms, that means I automatically do 2 parentheses. That tells me they're the same. What are they the same of? They're the same of minus. Okay, in order to get x to the 4th, I'm going to go x squared times x squared. And so to get 9 and 1, I could go 3 and 3, or I could go 9 and 1. But can you tell pretty quickly that 3 and 3 is not going to work? Because the outer would be 3x and the inner would be 3x. That's going to give me 6. That's not going to give me 10. Okay, so instead of 3 and 3, I'm going to go 9 and 1. Will that work? I think so, because the outer is minus 1x squared and the inner is minus 9x squared. That definitely gives me the minus 10, right? Okay, so I just did trial and error, but am I done? Well, look at that first parenthesis. Isn't that first one a difference of squares? So for that one, couldn't I say x plus 3 and x minus 3? And then what about that second parenthesis? Isn't that a difference of squares? So for that one, I could say x plus 1 and x minus 1. So first I did trial and error, and then on each of the parentheses, I did a difference of squares. Okay? So one more. And this is where we're definitely in the Algebra 2 level of factoring, where you have multiple kinds of factoring in one problem. All right, so when I look at letter D, I see 4 terms, but before I jump on grouping, do a quick check. Is there a common factor all the way across? And there's not, because the first 3 have x's, but that last one doesn't have an x, right? So there's no common factor all the way across. So that means 4 terms, so I think grouping. Okay, if I look at the first 2, I could take out an x cubed. That's going to leave me with x squared minus 4. Bring down the plus sign. Then look at the second 2. Is there a common factor? Yeah, we could take out an 8. That's going to leave me with x squared minus 4. Okay, I know I'm doing it right because those parentheses are the same, right? And so now I can take that parenthesis x minus 4 out in front, and what I have left is going to be the x cubed plus 8. Okay, so I just did factor by grouping. Am I done? Well, I don't know. Let's see. Look at that first parenthesis. Isn't that one a difference of squares? So I could make that be x plus 2 and x minus 2. Okay, look at the second parenthesis. That's not squares, but aren't they cubes, right? X cubed and 8, those are both cubes. And so remember, that's the type where you have one smaller parenthesis and one bigger parenthesis. Okay, what's being cubed? Well, that would be x and 2. So bring down whatever your original sign was. So I bring down a plus. Okay, so remember the formula, I need a squared, so that would be x squared. And then this sign is going to be opposite of the first one, which was plus. And then the middle term is a times b, so x times 2 is 2x. This is always a plus, according to the formula. And then the last term is going to be the b squared, so in this case 2 squared, which is 4. So there's my final answer. So first I did grouping, and then I did difference of squares, and then I did the sum of cubes. Whew, that's just a lot of fun. Okay, so that's the final set of notes for section 4.1.